Okay, I think we can start. Can you hear me? Just confirm, affirmative, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much, and welcome to this webinar organized by Afionet on our post-election review of the Liberian general elections. It's exciting times that we are in, that we are sitting here today reviewing one of the oldest countries in Africa, with some of the nurses developing electoral processes and systems. And it's still a very fledgling young democracy, despite 174 years of nationhood. As we are aware, the country went to the polls on the 10th of October, 2023. And this is the fourth time after 14 years, that is from 1989 to about 2003, bloody civil war, which ironically was attributed to election disputes in 1985. And these were designed to elect the president as well as members of the legislature. Subsequent elections were then held in 2005, 2011, and 2017. Significant of these elections is that this is the first time that the National Electoral Commission of Liberia is conducting elections outside the framework and support of the United Nations support to Liberia. And I think this session will also give us an understanding in terms of how they managed to fare. If anything else coming out from the results, they seem to have done pretty well. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome you to this exciting discussion. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Afionet for organizing this session. And on introducing my panelists, I would like to start with N as one of our panelists, Katurima. She's a Kenyan national with over close to 20 years of experience in inclusion, gender elections, democracy, good governance, youth affairs, women's peace and security. She's also an international election observer, having done missions with a number of international as well as regional bodies such as African Union, International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, National Republic Institute, IRI, National Democratic Institute, NDI, and also the Eastern Africa Standby Force, as well as ASA. It's quite a very rich CV on elections, and she was also in Liberia for this election. And I think the experience, as well as her participation, would also be an asset to this discussion. Welcome, N, to this session, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'll skip my brother Samson. I'm sure he's going to join us. Noxie Gwala is an expert on inclusion, electoral processes, and the use of technology in elections. Currently, she works with ASA and based in Liberia. And she has observed elections across many countries in Africa and offered advisory services to the African Union and regional economic communities on approaches to observing elections using ICTs. Welcome, Nox. Augustine Tamba is the head of secretariat and spokesperson for the Liberia Election Observer Network, LEON. LEON is the leading citizen observer group in Liberia. He holds a bachelor's degree in public administration from University of Liberia. And I think this discussion will benefit quite a lot and immensely from the experiences that you've had conducting the oversight of the electoral process in Liberia in the just ended election. Welcome, Augustine, and thank you for joining us. Paul is a democracy and human rights and civic empowerment expert and is currently working as a network coordinator for the West Africa Democracy Solidarity Network, WADMOS. He has observed several elections in Africa, including in Liberia, where he has been on a mission to ensure that the elections uphold public trust and confidence in multi-party politics. Welcome to the sessions, all our panelists, and we are excited that you are here, and I think would benefit quite immensely from the experiences that you cumulatively have on elections, but also on elections in Liberia. Just a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to start with broad introductory statements and go into the crux of the discussion. Members of the audience can post their questions on the board, and I'll refer to them as I go. Would like to have this discussion as participatory as possible. So feel free to add your suggestions on the board, and I'll constantly refer to them and would request members of the panelists to respond as and when they are up. Augustine, confirm that you can hear me. Okay. My first question, maybe I should direct it to Anne. The elections in Liberia came and they went, and a number of missions observed these elections. Maybe as a starter, you could bring us up to speed with key aspects of the election that lent credence to the electoral results. What did you see coming out of this election that led to what you might term lending credence to the electoral results? N.
Thank you, Taona, and greetings to all. The election for me went on well, started well, and even the deployment bit, we saw good arrival time of the materials, polling officials being in their polling places at the right time, at the right place, deployment of police officers, even though they were not quite significant, but we had the presence of police officers in the polling places, large turnout of voters with the large queues, and then come in the evening, the counting went on well, that it was done in a transparent manner. Then from there, we go to the magistrate's court, where now they were doing the collation. Also, it was done in a transparent manner. We could see the results being displayed on the screen. So I would say in the overall, things went well in terms of voting. Things went well on counting. Things went well on the collation bit. But also now, when it came to the announcement of results, also that went on well. But given the 15 days, I can say it was so slow. And I was joking with someone, it was more of when they were releasing the final results, that is NEC, they were giving in small doses like the malaria queen. So it came in small bits and pieces, and people were quite anxious. But anyway, given the 15 days, the NEC did extremely well. So if I give a general overview, the elections were done in a transparent, credible, manner.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, given the fact that I think you were in Liberia the previous election, the general elections, and now that you came back for these ones, what specifically stood out for you between the last elections and these elections?
What stood out for me is that in the 2017 election, the UN mission in Liberia was heavily present in terms of logistics and also in terms of the procurement of materials. This time round, the UN mission was not there. So the Liberian authorities purely conducted this election. I would say it was a Liberian election. But maybe what I can point out was the significant number of the invalid votes, which until now, I know NEC has said they will investigate as to why there were quite a number of invalid votes, but from where I sit, the numbers were too high. 5.8%, that is approximately 6%. It's quite a large number. And if you talk to people on the ground, everybody had varied reasons. And this brings to question, was it voter education? I know voter education started so late in the day, and being an election whereby there was also a form of biometric voter registration. This was the first of the kind. So it could have attributed to many people not being able to understand what it entailed. But also in the polling places, like most of the ones we visited, the lighting was too vague. So it could have affected also people when they were putting the mark on the ballot paper. It could have affected the other one also. And this one, maybe Noxie can speak about it. I've heard from across the circles, people were saying that the ballot paper was so small. So if I put my thumbprint goes to the next, to the next candidate. So that one, maybe Noxie can speak about it. And then also the inking. This was a peculiar trait because we've seen in previous and other elections, the inking part is done after you have already put the ballot in the ballot box. But in Liberia, they were doing it before. So now in this inking aspect, it could have affected whereby people, maybe you smudge the ballot paper in the process. So that one could also have contributed. And then also most of the polling places we visited, where in my country we call it the voting booth. In Liberia, they call it the ballot board. Many of them did not have, so the POs had to improvise. So you find that it may be a chair that someone is writing on. So that one could also have affected the issue of invalid votes. But for me, the takeaway was, yeah, it's the invalid vote was quite something. But in general, we saw quite a significant, good election that was conducted by Liberians themselves.
Interesting that you speak to issues around the invalids. I know from past experience that Leon did a very extensive study on invalid votes, and I think that report also sheds light to some of the issues that you have raised. But I think it would also be part of the audit, and it will be very interesting when the audits are done, just to kind of like get a sense of which areas were predominantly having invalids, and probably also just to look at the reasons thereof. I'll go to you, Noxie. Per the final results, we do not have a clear winner. I mean, the country is most likely going to a runoff, as no candidate managed to garner the required 50% plus one, and resulting in the country going into the second round. What is the situation like on the ground in terms of preparations currently? Are there any indications in terms of when the elections the rerun is going to be done, and what is the
Hello, we can hardly hear you.
Okay, let me get back again. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I think it's on his side. I can hear you.
You can hear me now?
I can hear
Okay.
you. I could hear you.
Okay.
I can also hear you.
Oh, yeah, okay there?
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll continue whilst we try and sort out your issue there. So Noxie, I mean, what is the situation in terms of preparations on the ground, and what is the situation in terms of acceptance of results after the announcement of the results?
Thanks, Tawana. I think all I can just say is that the situation is really quite peaceful. Monrovia is calm, and I think for me that shows the kind of discipline and tolerance that Liberians have had. And I think this is part of the fruits of that Farmington River Declaration as well, to a large extent, because even when there have been attempts, through fake news and so on, to try and raise suspicions on why the NEC is taking so long to actually declare the final results and so on, there have also been an equal measure to counter those narratives and to say NEC is still within its mandate. And as you know, they have 15 days to declare. And as I sit here today at 5 o'clock around, so I'll be going to the NEC to get that final declaration of the results, which we think will definitely be today. And from then on, we can be able to have possibly the green light in terms of the runoff that will probably be held again, at least within 15 days at the most. So we're working with the date for now of the 7th of November, tentatively. And that will then also then assist us in actually then being able to see the campaign period starting again and so on. So I think generally the message of tolerance and respect has echoed louder than other counter narratives to say don't trust the outcome, don't trust the process, and so on. And a lot is going on as well in terms of parties that are trying to file sort of disputes to the NEC with regards to how the first round went. So currently, as well as ISA, we have a lot of observers that are just following up at the magisterial courts, hearing disputes and so on that have been raised. So definitely the channels for redress are also open currently, and we think that's something that will go on even as we prepare for the runoff. So I think basically, I mean, even the senatorial candidates, because they are out of the woods, the senatorial candidates and the House of Representatives who have either won or lost, the ones who have won are celebrating, but those celebrations have been quite civil and quiet where they have been. And those that have lost as well are exploring their options, as I said, through that redress and possibly seeing how they can rally behind the presidential candidates. So the tensions, I think, have eased off a bit because the bulk of the candidates that were contesting, from the 1,030 candidates that contested in total, have gotten their outcome. And now the focus is just on that presidential election, where we definitely need a winner now. So that's all I can say.
Okay, interesting. I mean, in the build up to the elections, I think interlocutors were pointing out that these elections are going to be a game changer. And I think in the build up to the elections, there were some internal tensions within the country. But in the end, the election was actually deemed largely peaceful, although there were instances of election violence and I think allegations of vote tampering. But more important, also the harassment of candidates. But I mean, from where you were sitting, what were the key characteristics of the political environment leading up to the elections, and how did they impact the election? With this anticipation that was there, this pessimistic view among some interlocutors in terms of what was going to prevail. I mean, how did you see this playing out, and how did it impact the election process itself?
I think the environment, the political environment was highly competitive. There was a huge degree of mobilization, especially the mobilization of young people in Liberia. And with the country having such a huge population of youths, we saw a lot of youths being used as mobilizers for political parties. We saw a lot of them on the other divide trying to work with the NEC, especially as temporary staff and so on, trying to preach the message of peace. Especially those, your FLY, for instance, Federation of Youth, your NAMOT, and so on, doing a lot of civic and voter education. So for me, actually, I think linking back to what Anne was saying about the invalid ballots, it's quite shocking, because when we have to look at how CVE was done, I mean, it started way back in, I think it was April, when they were first doing the first phase of BVR, for instance. So it was done in segments, and literally for each and every process, from the voter registration to the exhibition of the voters' roll and so on, there were some levels of CVE cells that were done at the community level with community-based organizations and so on. And the structure was there. Definitely the use of CVE cells is a commendable structure that was implemented by the NEC in actually trying to work with communities, so people get messages in a language that they understand, from people that they can relate to. So I think for me, it's a matter of trying to figure out whether really it was timing, or whether it was the technicalities, as you said, and with regards to now the fact that people have so many options in terms of marking the ballot. In some countries, the basic mark that you need to know is to maybe do an X or a tick, and that's it. But in Liberia, there's so many options, and those we know are usually founded on the fact that you are trying to be as inclusive as possible in light of the literacy rate. But I think we need to ask the question of whether that doesn't go further in terms of confusing the voters, whereby you can use a fingerprint, you can mark, you can tick, and so on. So it raises a lot of questions in terms of what actually went wrong with those CVE cells. Another factor that stood out for me is the campaigning. Like, the campaign period in Liberia was so vibrant, more than I've ever seen. Literally, Monrovia would come to a standstill whenever, for instance, the CDC or the UP campaign, like there were large crowds, people had to close shops and so on. I've never seen that level of participation from, especially from young people. So that aspect, the extent of campaigning, to the point that there were even complaints during the BVR that parties and candidates were using the opportunity to conduct CVE to actually pre-campaign and so on. So that raised a lot of questions, and that stood out for me. Also, the factor of, during the BVR, there were a lot of complaints around voter tracking. So that is, for instance, taking voters from one district to another so that you can improve your base as a candidate and so on. There were lots of complaints with regards to the voter tracking, and we were all waiting to see how much of an effect that would have, or how that would play out on election day. But the narrative with regards to the energy that was put onto talks about voter tracking and what NEC should be doing and so on, during election day, it was very hard to actually prove that, or to really measure the extent of the voter tracking. But of course, we did see large crowds, and in some cases whereby candidates will maybe provide transport to citizens. But I mean, it opened up the issue of the law in Liberia is so vague that it's difficult to put a stop to such practices as pre-campaigning and voter tracking. And I think I'm very also much shocked in a way about the level of responsibility that NEC has for the whole entire electoral process. They had to, of course, do the BVR. At the same time, they are the ones as well in charge of hearing disputes. So in a way, they are the referee, they are the player. It's very hard to see where their job starts and where it ends, to the point that even when we had talks about the security apparatus in the country, or the capacity of the Liberian National Police to actually deploy adequate security and so on, a lot of the conversations went back to, but NEC should be doing something. NEC should be making sure that people that are conducting pre-campaigning or vote buying and so on are prosecuted. And when NEC says that depends, that is the job of the police, it was difficult, because the LNP would also come back to us and say, but NEC should tell us of these incidents and so on. So it resulted in a lot of gray areas in terms of, is it right really for an electoral commission to be a law onto its own like this, to this extent? Even regulations, they are in charge of making sure that they basically release those regulations without much really input, I think, from civil society. And the result of that is those vague sort of pronouncements with regards to the to terms such as pre-campaigning, with regards to campaign finance, and what constitutes an abuse of state resources and so on. So really, NEC, I think for me, had too much to do, that in some cases those things are mandated. So even the campaign finance aspect of the electoral process, NEC again for a long time has had this responsibility of ensuring compliance with its own campaign finance regulations and so on. And I think that those are some of the responsibilities that I think were too much. In some of the cases, you have a lot of independent bodies that also assist an electoral commission to basically look at disputes. The courts are way more active, especially even at in some countries, for instance, where I come from, we'd have during the elections an electoral court that kind of assumes that responsibility, or opens up just before the election to look at all matters related to the elections. But in this case, you're expecting someone, a magistrate who's administrating the election, to also then be the one who rules, to say, yes, I was wrong here, or I was not wrong in ruling in this way. So it was too much. And also candidacy requirements for the political parties and candidates. NEC also had to again come back and say you qualified or you didn't qualify, and also come back again and give that person redress where they were excluded and so on. So for me, it was a lot. So I think conversations definitely about the capacity and responsibility of the NEC stood out more. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think you did touch on a number of aspects of the electoral process, and I think also issues that have to do with the election dispute result regulations and the appeals processes. And I think it's quite interesting going into this election and also the post-election reviews that will be carried out, given the fact that I think there has been an attempt in the past to reform some of the aspects that you alluded to, but I think these were not implemented in time of the election. And I think it's a discourse and a discussion that might need to be carried over beyond the election. Augustine, are you available now? Augustine? Okay, I think Augustine is still having challenges with his network, and Samson is still to join us, but I think he will catch up as we go. I'll go to you, Paul. You have been following the elections in Liberia, and I think more importantly also the fact that you also had a team on the ground and should have done quite a lot of analysis in terms of the preparations for the elections itself. Prior to the elections, I think significant progress, including the passing in both the House of Representatives and the Senate to the new electoral law that sought to amend certain provisions of the law to align them to best electoral practices was undertaken. And I think significant in these reforms was the inclusion of provisions that makes it mandatory for political parties to allocate 30% of the seats to prospective women candidates. But I think also in addition, the amendments also made several pronouncements that seek to strengthen the independence of the NEC. And these were reforms that were welcomed by several stakeholders. However, the bulk of these were not passed into law before the elections, and the country went into elections with some of these issues still pending. How did these impact on the participation of women mostly, as well as the general conduct of the election? The fact that these reforms were not implemented prior to the election itself. Paul. I think you are muted, Paul.
Thank you very much, Aona. Thanks for having me. So for us at West Africa Democratic Solidarity Network, that's WADEMOS, we embarked on a pre-election assessment mission in collaboration with a number of civil society partners from West Africa. And the point that you raised about the proposed electoral reforms were very prominent in our conversations. But as you did indicate, most of these reforms did not see the light of the day, particularly the one on the gender, the Affirmative Action Bill. We were thinking that Sierra Leone had led the way with the Gender and Women Empowerment Act, which allowed a lot of women to get into the legislature after the elections. So there was a lot of high hopes going into the Liberia election that Liberia will learn from this best practice and pass the Affirmative Action Bill. Our understanding was that the proposed provisions in the bill, a lot of them were vetoed by the president and could not be implemented as part of the election. Our expectation is that after the elections, various post-election reforms and engagements should really bring this proposed electoral amendments and reforms back to the conversation. So that going into the next elections or the midterm elections, you know there are midterm elections around the corner. These laws can be factored in or be integrated into the electoral process. But I also want to touch some of the high points and low points that, as WADEMOS, we observed for this election. Going into the election, there were a lot of anxieties, and some of them have been mentioned by my colleagues already who have spoken ahead of me. The capacity of the Liberian National Police in terms of providing security was a big issue. Funding for the election also came up in most of the conversations ahead of the election, to the extent that we had the EC complaining about delays in the release of funding. And then the poor road networks and the rainy season that we find ourselves, where some of also where additional concerns that we thought could hinder or affect the deployment of logistics for elections. Then the most important being some political rhetorics and inflammatory language that had taken center stage a few days ahead of the election, and a few incidents of violence that had been recorded, which led to the death of 2 or so people. But in all this, we at Wadimons are quite impressed, and we commend all the stakeholders and the actors, particularly ECOWAS, which did a lot of mediation to calm down tempers, especially between the 2 major political parties. ECOWAS backed its mediation this time around by issuing public threats against any actor that may cause violence for this particular election. And the US, as an international partner to Liberia, looking at the historical relationship between the 2 countries, had also had cause to issue advice or alerts, cautioning all political actors who may contribute or in one way or the other, their actions or inactions may lead to violence during the election. So I think some of these initiatives contributed largely to the results that we experienced. But most importantly, we need to commend the people of Liberia, especially the voters. They exhibited a lot of patience and tolerance at the polling station. I was in Maryland, and for the number of polling stations that I was assigned to throughout almost the entire day, I witnessed long queues. The polling station that I witnessed, the counting process, voting ended around 8 p.m. at that polling station. The counting process was very inclusive, was very transparent, talking about the sorting of votes, the counting. They were all very, very transparent in the process. And the party agents that were present at the various polling places also collaborated strongly with the high professionalism exhibited by polling officers on the day of voting. So I think generally, going into the elections, our anxieties and fears have been dashed. And the expectation is that the second round will replicate these positive trends we had with the first round.
Thank you so much, Paul. And Augustine, if you can hear me, you as the head of Secretariat for Leon, and Leon was heavily involved in these elections in terms of providing oversight to the electoral process. We also noted that at the end of the process, you also endorsed the results announced by the National Electoral Commission as a true reflection of the elections results. May you bring us to speed with the key aspects of the elections that lend credence to the electoral results? What were some of the things that stood out for you that lent credence to the results, and also that made Leon to verify that the results were a true reflection of the will of the people of Liberia?
Well, thank you, Tayana. And my apologies, actually, for the delay in connecting. But I think the previous speakers ahead of me, and I listened to Nozolo, who tried to outline some of the issues that we actually observed in these elections. So, in the first place, Leon observed the entirety of the electoral process. We began the observation when we observed the BVR process conducted by the National Election Commission. We also tried to observe the campaign processes that were carried out by a political party. But during the observation of the BVR process, there was some doubt on the capacity of the National Election Commission in terms of enabling or the commission being able to conduct the BVR process. And that was from the background that this was the very first time Liberia were conducting such a process. And in terms of technology, the procurement of the equipment and the hiring of vendor all became a very big challenge for the National Election Commission, as was perceived by the general public. So one of the things that stood out very well for us is the willingness on the part of the National Election Commission to begin that BVR process and end the process in time. So there were two phases of the BVR process. And the National Election Commission ensured that that process began and ended also in time. So in terms of credibility, in terms of public trust, that exhibit by the National Election Commission raised some level of confidence within the general public that yes, indeed, the National Election Commission was on path in terms of ensuring that these elections were free, fair, and credible. Another aspect that actually stood up, even though there were some observation that we made in the electoral process, basically was around the candidate nomination process. Again, based on the timeline of the National Election Commission, there were a lot of doubts ahead of that process that the commission probably wouldn't have made it in terms of ensuring that the process begin and end on time. But the commission ensured that both the BVR process and that of the candidate nomination process began and ended in time, which lended some level of confidence within the election commission. But like Nozolo said, and like Paul was saying, the issue about the electoral reform actually has some impact on, especially the candidate nomination and the reduction in terms of female participation in this election. Because us as a country, I mean Liberians, we could not basically ensure the passage of the reform law. There were some aspects that could have been very much important for these elections that were captured within the reform process that were basically not covered because that law was not actually passed into law. Aside from that, we observed the opening process, and based on the report that we received as an institution, all of our observers reported with some high percentages of, in terms of the opening of polls, the presence of key materials at polling stations, the presence of security at polling station, the adequacy of net workers at each polling station. All of those were documented properly. That gave us a conclusion at the end of the day as an institution, giving credence to what the National Election Commission actually announced. But on the overall, Leon observed the elections using, for the first time, using an SBO methodology. And because of the application of that methodology to these elections, and based on what the National Election Commission announced, our data we analyzed, the data that Leon collected and analyzed were actually in line with what the National Election Commission was actually announcing in doing the pronouncement of the election results. So based on our observation and all of our exercises that we carry on, gave us the conclusion that what the National Election Commission was actually pronouncing reflected the will of the people. And like you listen to Paul indicating, all of the processes that we were observing in terms of the closing procedures, the counting procedures, all of those procedures, to the best of the reporting from our observers, they reported that these processes were transparent, they were credible, and that they were very participatory. And I mean, throughout our report gathering, our observers did not report anything that suggested otherwise. So based on all of these credible reports that we received, coupled with the scientific methodology that Leon deployed to observing these elections, we, at the end of the day, issued that statement because, again, the processes were verifiable, and that Leon was confident indeed that the results, as was pronounced by the election commission, actually reflected the will and the will of the people. One of the things that actually stood out again for us was the deduplication process of the voter roll, because that was a very major issue in the 2017 election. And it was predicated upon that the Supreme Court made that suggestion that Liberia move to biometric voter registration process. And because of the rigorous exercise that the National Election Commission applied to the voter roll in terms of identifying, double registering, ensuring that they presented a kind of figure to the general public of honor, age, registering, and the audit under which the voter roll went increased the level of confidence within both the political parties and also stakeholders that were following the process. So a lot of stakeholders and a lot of political actors moved to the elections with some level of confidence that the voter roll actually reflected the true representation of Liberians that should have participated in the entire process. So all of these exercises, all of these observations lended us to the point of conclusion that what the National Election Commission announced and that these processes were actually in adherence with the will and pleasure of the people.
Thank you so much, Augustine. And I think maybe as a follow-up question, what were there any challenges faced, or were there any challenges faced by the Commission in carrying out its duties during this process? And if there were any, what were the challenges? Because I think it would then start feeding into the discourse that we might be having post-election in terms of the interventions that might be looked at for supporting the National Electoral Commission. So what were some of the challenges faced by the Commission in carrying out its duties and mandate?
So at the inception of the entire exercise, the Electoral Commission had some challenges. One had to be the acquisition of the vendor in terms of carrying out the DVR process. That process actually took a lot of time in terms of concluding that process. And from the inception, because of the delay from the angle of the National Election Commission, the general public began to speculate in terms of the commission having a full capacity to conducting the 2023 general and presidential elections. So that was one of the challenges from the part of the Election Commission. Another challenge that we observed was basically on the issue of human capacity. The issue of human capacity in terms of carrying out the actual work by those that were hired by the commission. And because of that, in phase 1 and phase 2 of the DVR process, coupled with the malfunctioning of some of the equipment, we saw in some places that there were delays. But on the overall, one of the major challenges the commission had was on the issue about the way resources were being disposed to the commission. Over the period of time, the commission has struggled in terms of how they get resources from central government, and that by and large had impeded the way the commission goes about conducting its work. And even with the conduct of this election, at the dying minute up to September 28, 29, the commission was still announcing that they have not received full funding from central government, which to a large extent slowed down some of the activities of the Election Commission. And if we can relate that aspect to the outcome of the results, talking about the number of invalid votes that were experienced vis-a-vis the pronouncement by the National Election Commission of deploying CVE cells, one would have thought, especially with the background that with the study that Leon did, one would have thought that the deployment of CVE cell would have actually reduced the number of invalid votes in this election. However, I mean, we are seeing the contrary. We are seeing the contrary that we have even more invalid votes in these elections. And that is primarily tied towards the lack of resources from the National Election Commission, because the commission probably did not have resources to give these organizations that were recruited to carry out CVE cells. During the campaign, most of the civic voter education that was being carried out were carried out by either candidates or political parties. And that was the point that Nozolo was alluding to. Because of the active participation of political parties into voter education activities, political parties were accused of pre-campaigning, and they were accused of going ahead of the National Election Commission in terms of campaigning. But that was primarily because there were not a kind of systematic approach by the commission to ensuring that these CVE cells that they deployed were empowered over a long period of time. And so that became, or that is also a very serious challenge for the National Election Commission. Another challenge that the commission will have, and I think that is also not part of this discussion, but in post-election reviewed activities, will also be in terms of implementing the law. Now, there is a provision within our law in terms of political parties who fail to attain a certain percentage on the average. And I think it is Section 5 of the new election law that requires political parties to obtain 2% and above. That any political party who don't attain such percentage, they will be banned for 2 consecutive elections. That will also be the challenge on the part of the National Election Commission in terms of implementing that law. And that is where civil society like us or like Leon, we are now beginning to see what might happen. And if that happens eventually, it might lead to Liberia having either 2 or 3 political parties per the law that will be qualified to contest the next election. But all of these, I mean, are challenges that the commission, that the Electoral Commission have prior, during, and even after the election, the 2023 elections. So that would be my response to probably the question you asked.
Thank you so much, Augustine. I think it did open up a number of issues that we might also need to look at going into this discussion. But I think the subject matter that normally everyone is coming back to is around the invalids. And I think it's an area that we might need to have more discussion around later on as we wind up this process. And probably something that might also be taken up post-election in terms of interventions that can be designed to try to mitigate this. Noxie, your organization was in the country for some time, and you did observe the campaign processes in Liberia. What were some of the key dynamics and trends that you observed? Do you think that this election tend to focus on issues? Was it on personalities? What are kind of like some of the dynamics that you observed during the campaigns?
Thanks for that, Tawana. So, I mean, on this aspect, I mean, for me, it was to say that actually when you compare where Liberia is in terms of regulating or having regulations around campaign financing, like the legal framework is good. It does pertain to restrictions in terms of the use of state resources. It does describe what types of funding the parties and candidates are allowed to how they are supposed to generate funding, for instance. So the legal framework is there, but for me, what is missing is the aspect of monitoring the campaign finance. And I think for the first time, it was good because we did see an attempt by an institution called Integrity Watch. I think they launched their campaign quite late, though it was in July, whereby they were now going to try and assist the NEC in terms of ensuring that they can, they can enforce, make sure that the parties are complying or tracking compliance to these regulations. But unfortunately, the framework actually leads to, because of the candidates have to generate private sources, their own funds and so on. It has led to personality-based campaigning, whereby the parties contesting most of the time, their mandates or their sources or issues of campaigning and so on were being prescribed by individuals, as opposed to what are the parties' interest with regards to the development of Liberia. So a lot of the time it was issue-based campaigning, and also we saw a lot in terms of the use of state resources, whereby observers did come across many instances whereby the ruling party was utilizing state resources to actually campaign, especially through the use of vehicles, government vehicles and so on during the campaign period. There was also a lot of allegations that we received about people being paid to go and register, especially underage registrants, and also later on as the election day approached, as 10 October approached, there were also then instances of allegations that certain candidates and parties were buying people's voters' cards. And of course, when we tried to go further and find out why and so on, we couldn't necessarily be able to get that type of sensitive information in terms of who is buying these cards and what will they be using those cards for on election day. And then I think also I just want to talk a bit about, there was a lot of dissatisfaction as well with regards to the use of state resources on the pre-campaigning, but because it was mainly the ruling party that campaigned as early as March. For instance, they did a lot of activities that sometimes led to allegations that this is now campaigning, it is no longer civic and voter education. So I think when the 5th of August finally came, the NEC was quite relieved, because all that talk about pre-campaigning, now the field was open, and people generally tended to forget about that. The pressure to do something about that pre-campaigning was not as much anymore. And then in terms of those political, in terms of the political candidates as well, a lot of them are either businessmen and that means they have a lot of money at their disposal, to the fact that even the media landscape was quite biased, because we found that in communities, for instance, community radio stations that are supposed to be reflecting interests of communities and so on, they are actually owned a lot of the time by a certain political candidate or a political person who has their own interests. And so the narratives that were sent out were very much biased in favor of one candidate over the other. So that was quite difficult. And then we also saw the mobilization of partisans as well along ethnic lines, and also in terms of, it led to even traditional authorities being forced to take sides. In Maryland, for instance, we had a case of a council of a chief who was basically removed from their position by the general superintendent in that county because he refused to campaign for the ruling party, and he said he had his own party that he wanted to campaign for. So it also led to this sort of clash as well with regards to bodies such as traditional bodies that are primarily supposed to be involved in peace building and community building, now being forced to take lines because, failure to do that, the government will probably take that vehicle that they bought you before the campaign and so on. So the narrative was not good with regards to what happens, whereby political parties are now owned by whoever is paying out of their own pocket. And the biggest losers as well in this framework were women. because women were then in an even more vulnerable position because usually women do not have adequate financial muscle and so on. They had to depend on those very same men who they were competing with for some level of resources and so on to enable them to campaign. And because obviously as well during the candidate nomination period, we saw a lot in terms of the requirements to the financial requirements that you need to run in Liberia. For instance, candidates needed to have some sort of proof that they are in good compliance with the Liberian Revenue Authority, that they are able to pay taxes and so on, that they had like a minimum, I think, of 10,000 or so in their private bank accounts and so on. So it shows you the type of pressures that women faced were actually even more than their male counterparts. The same, I think, it was also a disservice to young people because within political participation, a lot of them could not necessarily run, and they resorted to basically being the mobilizers for those political parties and so on. So it left young people and women in particular more vulnerable. And I mean, we are seeing the outcome now as we look at the list of the House of Representatives and the Senate and so on, to say that it doesn't look good for women and youth representation. But I think on the upside as well, there are some good stories whereby there are women, for instance, in Grand Chide, for the first time, a woman was elected as a representative there, and it was mainly because of her grassroots sort of community work and so on. So in a way, we are also seeing that the Liberian is becoming more sophisticated in terms of they can accept the handouts that they receive from the big men in politics and so on. But at the end of the day, they understand that they are the power of their vote, and they are willing to vote against ethnic lines and party lines and so on. So I think it was basically a bit of good and bad. But I think we should always commend the fact that the campaign period was actually relatively very peaceful, in the context whereby there was not even adequate security in terms of even the police guarding the candidates and so on during the campaign period. There were a lot of fights with regards to now most of the candidates had to take it upon themselves to provide their own security because the state could not do that. So there was a lot of resolve that needed to be taken, especially on the part of the candidates and citizens, to actually get this election to where it is now, where we can sit and talk about what is happening next in a peaceful environment. So I think for me that was good.
Thank you so much, Knox, for that. Let's go to election day operations. Maybe you can share your insights into the election day activities, including the deployment of security forces and the overall conduct of the election itself. In that also, maybe you can actually highlight some of the reported irregularities or incidents that might have affected the integrity of the voting process itself.
In terms of the election day, there was large turnout of voters. And remember, this is the first election where the young people who were born post the Liberian War, this was the first time they were voting. So excitement was in the air and people were out there and they came out to vote in large numbers. When you go to the polling places, the capitation was 510. And this led to a massive queue of people who had come to vote. And now, because of this, the 510, so we found that also the election officials were quite overwhelmed because there were about 5 in each polling place. There were about 5 officials. And then you have this large number of people, 510, the capitation that has been put there. So there were quite large number of people who came out. When it came to the accessibility of the polling place, of course, the polling places were in schools or institutions, and others were in open places. So in terms of accessibility, there were some that were not accessible to people with disability. Others were accessible to people with disability, because you could find there's a polling place that was in a raised ground. So how would someone who has a form of disability come in? Then another good thing we saw that in terms of the voting was the tactile ballots, which were present in every polling place. And I remember this was a question in the checklist. And every polling place we went, they had the tactile ballot. So the people who had the visual disability could be able to use. And as Noxie, Paul, and also Agustin spoke about, the polling places opened on time. So cases where the polling places opened late were very minimal. Most of them opened on time. Then distractions were quite minimal, apart from now the queue controllers got overwhelmed by the large turnout. And as we earlier observed, security agencies, it was one security agent per polling place, and you have to man 510. And then in each polling, the voting precinct, which now is the bigger one, had quite a large number of crowds. So in some cases, a voting precinct only had one security agent. So now some of these, we saw that the security agents were overwhelmed. And I know one of the recommendations of ASA where I observed with was that the polling place, they have to decrease the numbers and increase the polling places from 510 maybe to a lesser number. Then the other one now we saw was after the elections. And this is where now for me, a major distraction came about. This is where now the UP, the United Party, and the CDC, which is the ruling party, started announcing themselves as winning. So that you go to the press and you say, we are in front, we are winning. The other one comes and says, you are winning. So that one almost destabilized the peace and the tranquility that we had seen on the voting day, where people were so calm and quiet and collected. But now when it came to the next day now, some of these political parties were behaving badly. But I thank NEC came in and rained on them and reminded them that the only people who are allowed to announce results were NEC. It was NEC, and this one now they stopped. But in general, the voting day went on well. Yeah.
Whilst I still have you, what were some of the, how did you rate the results management system? I think, most elections in Africa are normally disputed at that level. And how did technology play a role in results transmission? And how reliable was technology in this regard?
Given what has been happening in West Africa, I can rate the transparency of the election and the transmission was incredible. Done in a transparent manner, because all of us were in the polling place. And I remember the presiding officers would account for each and every ballot paper. Each and every ballot book was accounted for. Then that went on to be recorded, including also the invalid, which was well documented and well accounted for. Then now from there, the announcement of results were done, and then they were affixed at the door as per the law, and everybody could see the results. Then from there, they went to the magistrate's office, where now the transmission was being done. And we could see, as they were inputting on the database, we could see what was being inputted. And if there was any, for example, if there was any irregularity or any questions, it was done on the spot, and it was verified on the spot, because observers were allowed in, party agents were allowed in, and also also the media were allowed in those in the magistrate offices, and we could see clearly the transmission. So in terms of transmission, it was incredible, and it was very transparent.
Thank you so much. And I think it also made it easy for some of us in remote areas to follow the results as well. So I think maybe technology did play a very significant role in terms of ensuring the results transmission, but also the announcement of results. Paul, WEDMOS deployed a mission to observe the elections there in Liberia. What were some of your key findings? And also maybe if you can also speak to the security that ensured during the election period. What impact did it have on voter turnout and confidence in the process? I mean, given the events that are happening in West Africa, you would have expected that there would be some security challenges, but also skepticism in terms of participation in the electoral processes, given the experiences that we are having in the region. Paul, do I have you? Oh, yeah. I think you are muted, Paul.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you now.
You can hear me now. Thanks for having me back. When we did the pre-election mission, and also on election day, some of the findings that we came across was the trust level in the EMB, that's the National Electoral Election Commission. And this had historical antecedents where some previous appointments involved bipartisan consultation processes to get replacements on the EMB, that's the National Election Commission. Then subsequently, there were some vacancies that had to be filled, and the opposition was making a call that the incumbent party should also replicate that kind gesture that was extended to them, to engage them in consultation and get their involvement in the appointment process of the new commissions who term had expired at that term and had to be replaced. This created a lot of tension, and the United Party, which is the opposition, raised a lot of suspicion around the appointment process. And generally, if you look at the composition of EMBs in West Africa or in Africa, that's been a major concern, even for citizens in general. Afrobarometer data shows that trust levels in election management bodies keep decreasing. And the last survey that was conducted by Afrobarometer, trust level in election management bodies is at all-time low. So this is something, because the umpire, the referee for the election, is very critical in mobilizing trust, in building confidence in the electoral processes and systems. So if trust levels are very low in such a body, I think a key reform agenda should be on how we can restore trust and confidence in our election management bodies. It's very critical. Then the issue of fake news and inflammatory and political rhetorics that characterize election environments. And this is also something that you find the media also complicit, and also political parties actively involved in propagating fake news just to lure unsuspecting voters to their camp. We want to commend the activities of organizations like Weah that is doing a lot of fact-checking. But I think we must go beyond fact-checking to identify appropriate regulatory frameworks that can help us stem the tide of fake news that has characterized our political dispensation, and it's also very rife during period of elections, because it has a tendency to trigger violence if not timely counted by institutions that are really doing fact-checking and all others. Another observation we made is also with the close of polls. We noticed that Liberia has one of the late times for closing election on election day. I think it's 6 p.m., right, Augustine? And for us, we were just trying to benchmark that against other countries in West Africa, and Nigeria is 2 p.m. So we were very much particular to observe how the voting process will be patronized by voters throughout the entire voting period. And you could see the queues were sustained throughout the voting day. And as I did mention earlier, in the polling station that I voted, the queue was consistent throughout the voting period until 7 or 7:30 p.m. thereof that the last person voted. So it tells you that there's a logic and science behind the selection of 6 p.m. But we saw that still we can look at it, because the voting process was also quite slow in most of the polling places, especially in rural places. The time taken for one voter to the turnaround time for a voter was on the higher side. They spent a lot of time in the polling booth. And as my colleagues had already mentioned, the lighting system was very poor. So they had to keep coming back and forth to get clarification from electoral officers at the polling places and polling precincts. So I think in general, I want to put a lot of spotlight on the EMB. The issue of campaign finance has also been mentioned largely by Nozin. And we appreciate the collaboration between the National Election Commission and Integrity Watch. But when we met the National Election Commission, they told us that they've had challenges with its implementation. So they have reached out to an independent civil society organization, that is Integrity Watch. This is the kind of collaboration that will help build trust and build resilience in institutions like the National Election Commission. We should encourage that kind of partnership and cooperation between the National Election Commission and civil society or other non-state actors. Finally, I want to touch on another very important narrative that characterize the environment ahead of the election, and that would have been a red flag if not addressed timely. This had to do with the issue of whether voting was going to be done biometric or manual, because Liberia, for the first time, had moved from the Omicron system and compiled a biometric voter register. So the assumption was that going into the election day, voting will be done biometric. Unfortunately, that was not the agreement. So when we did our pre-election mission, engaged election commission and other stakeholders, we also identified this inconsistency and raised the need for a lot of voter education. But I do understand the dynamics surrounding the Liberia political environment that made the EMB to pause in deploying biometric verification process on election day. They explained to us that a lot of the counties had connectivity issues. So it may be difficult to deploy the technology across board. And then the literacy level and understanding among Liberian citizens wasn't that much high in terms of understanding how the BVR work on election day. So they felt that to avoid any potential danger, there was the need to go by the manual verification process. But I also want to mention that the manual verification process was itself a red flag going into the election, in the sense that how were you going to eliminate multiple voting? Because technology will help you to do away with double voting and all, because technology will give you to a larger extent one man, one vote. That brings into the equation the high level of trust among the key stakeholders involved in the election. Because if you look at where the party agents were sitting on election day and where the election officials were also seated, you could see quite of a distance. But if not the issue of trust, it could have generated a lot of conjunction or confusion between party agents and election officers. So I think that trust also played a lot of role in this election, where party agents, to a larger extent, trusted the election officials. And this trust was validated during the ballot counting sorting processes, where you do not have challenges with reconciling the ballot issues and the remaining ballots. Most of the place I stayed for the counting after the voting didn't have any issue of overvoting. And that's why I commended the election officers who were deployed by the NEC and the training that they received. But trust counted a lot on election day.
Thank you so much. And by way of winding up, as we are going to wind up, I will give you the last floor. Maybe if you could look at the work of regional networks such as Weah and Afionet. what could they have done better to contribute to ensuring free and fair, transparent elections? Because we are also trying to draw on experiences, and probably some of the lessons and the issues that you discovered on the ground could be lessons that could be used for organizations such as Weah and AFUNIT, insofar as other elections in the regions are concerned. So what could they possibly have done better, or what did they do better? And planning in going ahead, what could they do better?
I think back to the point I made that they did very well in terms of managing expectations, calming tempers ahead of the elections. I've already mentioned the intervention of a very important mediating actor like ECOWAS that played a lot of mediation before and during and even after the elections, when some political party actors were putting out some narratives of possibly winning the election. ECOWAS also intervened a lot when there was this narrative that there could be a one round victory for any of the parties, which wasn't possible looking at the dynamics of this election. So I think the role of ECOWAS in this election, lessons have been learned from Sierra Leone, where I think ECOWAS was too quick to draw conclusion. But this time around, as a regional organization, we monitored the activities of ECOWAS, and we noticed that really ECOWAS followed and made sure that all the boxes were ticked before coming out to release a preliminary statement that really touched on the core issues at stake. And they were timely in even issuing or giving out the possibility of deploying sanctions should people misbehave or engage in violence. But on a more substantive issue, I think Liberia should move forward a bit to deploy biometric voting. Because, as I said, the trust level between the party agents and the election officials could elude us one day. Technology will help you to solve this trust deficit, which has the potential of undermining the integrity of elections. If election officials decide to conduct themselves, the only check or validation that will come on the election officers will be the use of the technology to really monitor and ensure there's accountability on the part of election officials. I've also mentioned the issue of reforming the election management body. The campaign finance regulation still has a lot of deficits that I think the post-election reforms should look at and see how, especially being on the part of West Africa, how we can harmonize campaign finance regulations and ensure support countries to reduce the excessive money in politics that we are experiencing. And then the passage of the affirmative action bill, it has to be sustained, learning from the experiences from Sierra Leone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And in this order, N, Knox, and then Tamba, probably maybe by way of concluding, in light of the Liberian election experience, what lessons can we draw for other African countries facing some democratic challenges, as well as the military coups that we've actually seen in the region? And probably also, you can also give us your insights on how the region, as well as international organizations, can better support African nations in safeguarding their democratic processes. I'll start with you, and then go to Knox, and then Tamba.
In terms of lessons learned and what the region can learn from Liberia is that this was a Liberian election, and the Liberians themselves came out in large numbers, not only planned the election, but also conducted an election, a credible and a transparent one. So what can the region learn is that the democratic space and the place is still relevant in entrenching democracies in our governance space, so that even the coups that continue to happen in our region and also in Africa at large, this is something that can be done through the ballot, like we have seen the Liberians themselves do, and a credible process for that matter. Having observed the elections with ASA, and knowing ASA was the organization that was on ground since January, and seeing them collaborating with other agencies, and knowing that the democratic space and also the funding for democratic processes continues to shrink, how can we broaden? I've seen ASA, for example, they continued working with other local CSOs to entrench and also enhance the democratic process. And maybe now going forward, more collaborations will need to be done with other domestic players in the field in Liberia. And I know ASA will be on ground until next year, and they continue to collaborate. And this is something that we can also learn from the region. We saw also Yaga Africa having a peer learning mission to Liberia. This is something also Afionet maybe can, for example, take on board. How can you have maybe deploy a peer learning mission, for example, or a solidarity mission also with our other Afionet members within the region. So these are some of the lessons learned and some of the steps that can be taken by the regional agencies.
Thank you so much. Nox?
Thanks, Tawana. I think for me, the big lesson that we can take from Liberia is really the participation of the citizens in this election. Especially looking into the fact that, especially in the southern region and in the East African regions, for instance, voter apathy is something that we are talking about almost every day, whereby in those countries you will say the stability, the threats of coups and so on are very minimal. But at the same time, citizens are not showing through the ballots that they prefer elections as a means of actually confirming a government's authority to govern, and is actually ensuring that democracy thrives and so on. So in the case of Liberia, what was very interesting is that based on the preliminary figures, the voter turnout is around 77%. And it confirms what I saw during the campaign period as well, whereby there was a huge rate of participation, and also during the registration period as well. So in most of the contexts, it's actually vice versa, whereby you can be able to attract large numbers of people during the campaign, but those people won't turn out to actually come and vote. So for me, that's a big lesson learned, that actually Liberia can, I think, at the continental scale, speak to what were some of the factors that are actually leading to this high turnout. And even if you look at 2017, for instance, the average was actually as well pretty high. And also another dilemma that I'm seeing, and I think this is across board really, is this issue in terms of the proliferation of candidates and political parties doesn't necessarily mean that citizens feel like they have alternative choice. And in Liberia, that is definitely what I've been seeing, because again, in 2017, for instance, both Boakai and President Weah, they commanded around 67% or so of the votes cast, and then the remaining 32% and so on went to those smaller parties. But now, fast forward now, 2023, both Boakai and Weah again are commanding almost 80% of 80 something percent of the total votes cast, and the rest have to share that 12%. So what lessons can be learned from that? Because we are seeing again that the environment is still heavily polarized as well, but people or citizens are resolute in saying, we don't see a need for all these other choices. They are not the alternate choice, and we'll limit our votes to these top two candidates. So I think there's a lot of lesson sharing that we need to embark on in terms of looking at that good practice, because the best currency, I think, for a democracy to thrive is through citizen participation. And this election has shown that, and the proof is in that voter turnout. So there are lots of lessons that can be drawn in terms of what did Liberia actually do right, considering that, I mean, when we first came in during the pre-election, tensions were high in terms of the country's post-war status, and especially coupled with high competition, inadequate security, infrastructure, and so on. It seemed like the odds were really against them. But if the voter turnout is anything to go by, I think actually the West African continent actually has a lot to learn from Liberia rather than vice versa. So those are my closing contributions in terms of definitely more serious post-election work by even the national observer groups and domestic groups as well. We have a lot to do in terms of sensitizing people beforehand, in terms of where does our work start as observers and where does it end, so that citizens can also understand our role as well. That we are not there, for instance, to blow the whistle whenever we see any injustice, but the power as well of observation is that learning throughout the election, in and out, and actually fostering dynamic learning, where we draw citizens from across the continent to come and observe elections and implement those best practices whenever they go back to their own institutions and so on. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Noxie. Tamba.
Thank you. And let me say thanks to our panelists. But I think one of the biggest lessons was the willingness of the National Election Commission to be transparent in this process against public concern. I think the National Election Commission actually demonstrated that willingness to conducting this process on a free, fair, and transparent manner. I think that actually stood up in terms of the lessons that we can learn in terms of EMBs, ensuring that against public perception, that they can demonstrate that willingness to conducting free, fair, and transparent election. And I think we see that coming out from the National Election Commission, which is a credit to the commission. In terms of lesson learned, I think nationally we can draw some lessons, but also try to tie it in with other international concerns. So one of the lessons that I think we can learn from this election is the fact that once there are lack of clear laws that speak to how political parties should demonstrate or should guard themselves, they also have some consequences. And the fact that Liberia could not pass or could not reform 8 laws, we are seeing now that there will be actually low women political participation coming out of these elections, because there will be fewer women that are going to be elected. If the law was going to be passed, at least all of the political parties that submitted lists will have had 30% women candidate on their list. The probability of women then at that time getting elected will have actually been high. But because we don't have that law in place, we are seeing a massive decline of women participation, which I think is one of the biggest lessons that we can learn, and also trying to see how that can form part of our post election engagement activities. Again, we must say that in terms of multi-party democracy, as Liberians have yearned for multi-party democracy, is trying to be diluted based on the fact that citizens themselves are now trying to narrow the competition between political parties. And in these elections, we had 20 political parties contesting. Unfortunately, there is not a third party that is very close to the top 2 political parties. And like I indicated initially, if our laws are to be upheld in the next 2 consecutive elections, we might not have all of these political parties coming up again, because the law then will restrict them in terms of their participation. So I think that's one of the lessons we can learn from these elections, and also the fact that Liberians themselves were able to initiate and conduct these elections. This is the first election that have been conducted purely by Liberians in terms of security, in terms of all of the administrative work, and I think that was applause to this election, or that's applause to this election. We are still waiting for the runoff election, and we will see how that eventually interplay. I think if the National Election Commission continued on this path in terms of upholding its credibility, they are going to make some marks at the end of this election. And we are encouraging the National Election Commission, especially for the runoff election, tensions are high. I mean, political parties, the two political parties that are in this runoff, one political party is seeing themselves very close to power, another political party is seeing themselves like losing power. The attention in this election, the National Election Commission needs to opt their game in terms of the pronouncement of the runoff elections results and to ensuring that they continue to exhibit the acts of transparency and building confidence in this process. So I think those would be my take in terms of what lessons we can learn from these processes.
Thank you so much, Augustine. I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to divide it amongst the four of you. That will give you about 15 seconds. Your message to Liberians as they prepare for the runoff, starting with N, going to Tamba, going to Knox, and then to Paul.
My message to Liberians is that you have come so far, and the future is bright. So go for it and make a good choice when it comes to the runoff for the good of your country.
Thank you so much. I know, N, you are missing Nigerian Pepe. Hopefully, we might get you back for the runoff. Knox?
My message to Liberians really is that well done in terms of showing up and really showing up in the first round of these elections. Your turnout was commendable. Your patience in those polling places to wait and to cast your ballots in a peaceful manner is commendable. And to say, show the same energy as well during the second round. So let's not get to a point whereby that 70% turnout turns into a 40% turnout during the presidential election. So as much as you voted for your House of Representatives and your Senate, the president is basically the big person in power who will be able to make those decisions and direct those senators and House of Representatives. So you need to really vote for someone that you believe will put Liberia forward in terms of prospering this beautiful country. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know you are still enjoying the Pepe, so continue enjoying it. Paul, do I still have you? I think I've lost Paul. So Augustine, your message to Liberians as they go into the runoff, you've got 15 seconds.
I think my message would be that Liberia, we have demonstrated the willingness to lead in terms of democracy in this sub-region. The elections that we just conducted have played out very well. It has gone down the annals of history that yes, indeed, Liberia and Liberians are demonstrating the fact that they can and be able to go through a peaceful process. We are encouraging all young people to go out for the second round and be peaceful, cast your vote for whoever candidate you think can move Liberia forward. We are a rising star in terms of leading in this area, and so let us conclude that by ensuring that we remain peaceful in the runoff election. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Yes. What I must once again congratulate the people of Liberia, all stakeholders, the National Electoral Commission, civil society, Lyon, ECC, international partners. I think the level of interest and attention that we've paid to this election give us a lot of hope for democracy in Africa. Going into the second round, our expectation is that the same zeal, the same enthusiasm that the people of Liberia has shown for the first round, they should go ahead and emulate this best practice. The whole of Africa is looking up to them. This year, we've had 3 elections. Nigeria remains inconclusive. There is a petition against the Supreme Court ruling that is still hanging as an albatross on the neck of the government, undermining its legitimacy. In Sierra Leone, they recently had a Benjamin conference to promote inter-party dialogue and reconcile the current feud between the 2 leading political parties. And we don't expect Liberia to go this trajectory. they've already demonstrated enough confidence, and we continue to pray with them, and we wish them the very best as they prepare for the second round. A lot of responsibility will be placed on political parties, and we are counting on the political parties to maintain the camaraderie, the collegiality, the friendship that is showing, and use the legal and lay down procedures to resolve any grievance. I want to thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you so much. For myself, allow me to congratulate the people of Liberia for the peaceful and transparent conduct of the general elections. I would like to commend, just like anybody, like most of our panelists, the National Elections Commission and the security forces for their professionalism in the elections. But also, more importantly, I think the partners that supported Liberia through the UNDP Liberia Electoral Support Project, which I believe played a very significant role in supporting the capacity building of the NEC. Credit also goes to leading oversight, electoral oversight CSOs in Liberia, such as Leon, ECC, that provided oversight to the electoral process. Lastly and importantly, the people of Liberia for their peaceful conduct, and may the peace witnessed in the first round prevail in the second round. And this, ladies and gentlemen, marks the end of our discussion. And let me lastly thank the panelists for availing themselves for this important discussion. And I think we are going to be having more and more discussions as people of Liberia prepare to go for the runoff, as well as post-election discussions, particularly for some of the issues that have arisen from this discussion and interventions therefore. So from us, thank you so much from the Afionet team, and hopefully we'll see you again in the next discussions, and have a pleasant day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.